Hello and welcome back to the Success Catalyst podcast. My name is Nina, I'm your host, and today I have with me Patrick Eilers, a licensed professional counselor with a unique blend of theological and psychological expertise. With a master's degrees in clinical counseling psychology from Moody Theological Seminary, Michigan, and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Spring Arbor University, Patrick has dedicated nearly a decade to helping individuals navigate personal challenges. Patrick specializes in individual and group therapy, focusing on sexual addiction as a certified sexual addiction therapist. Patrick's passion for integrating theology with psychology sets him apart, and we're excited to delve into insights on mental health and personal growth. So, welcome to the show, Patrick.
Thank you, Nina. I'm really looking forward to being here. Appreciate it.
I'm happy to have you here today with us. So, can you start maybe by sharing with us what motivated you to pursue a career in counseling and psychology?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I started my journey kind of out of high school. I mean, I graduated in 2007. And so I was in that position where I wanted to, I really felt like I really wanted to, my biggest goal is to help people. That's obviously one of the things I really like to do. I want to see people inspired. I want to see people kind of getting unstuck in their life and kind of moving forward and things. And so I had the opportunity when I was, pretty much right out of high school. I had really never had necessarily a tangible talent, so to speak. I was really good at sports or really good at some creative outlet or whatever the case might be. At least I didn't feel like at the time. So I started kind of looking into psychology, and it was something that I had interest in. I just kind of kept moving forward with it. And, it worked out that all my time all at schooling I've been in, I've really kind of felt like it's just been a calling for me to kind of continue to go down that road of inspiring and helping people. And that's what my main goal is. So that's kind of how I really got involved with it. Start throughout my time, started when I entered the field back in 2016. I kind of worked with the general population. So I worked with kind of everybody. My first practice I was part of, and so we worked, with kids from ages like 5 all the way up to 62. I had clients in that whole range of folks. So kind of worked with everything and everybody for a little while, and then had an opportunity to be part of a startup clinic back in 2019, which was really cool. Kind of got a chance to start from the ground up with those folks, and again, kind of seeing the general population for the most part, but mostly adults and adolescents. At that point, I started kind of stopped working with kids. I realized that wasn't really a specialty for me. And then in 2020, I had an opportunity to come to where I'm at currently, and our clinic, particularly where we're at now, specializes, like I said, in sex addiction and partner behavioral trauma. So those are kind of our areas of expertise that we work in. And getting an opportunity to work as a specialist has been a little bit different, a little bit more unique. You kind of work only with that population for the most part, but you still bring a lot of elements of your training and things that you learn and life experience into those sessions. So it's not like it's just exclusively only talking about sex or those kind of things, but that's sort of where things usually sort of start as far as most of the folks we work with. So that's kind of how I got to kind of where I'm at now.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, Patrick. And I feel it's really amazing to know one's purpose. And if your purpose is about really helping people get out of this addictive environment or any addictive habits, that's amazing in the sense that this may be something that would be holding them back from the life that they want, because with such addictions, we get stuck and we don't really know how to move out of this pattern, of this environment, sometimes of this social bubble that would like go around us and really prevent us from growing, from evolving, from having a normal life. And probably even we can get involved in many more addictions. I think being addictive could become a trait of character.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what do you think about that?
I think it certainly has, it becomes normalized, right? So I think that's one of the things we see a lot. And it's more than just necessarily like sex addiction is considered a process addiction, meaning that it's a little more, it's not quite like a substance, but it's not quite of something that's a relationship, so to speak. You kind of are addicted to the sort of the pleasure, the good feelings, the dopamine, whatever you kind of want to word that in your mind as far as experiencing sexual pleasure. And again, processes are very similar to like a food addiction kind of thing. It's a similar type of category. So when we look at it in that way, like there's a lot of things that people, not only people can addicted to those processes, but they also can get addicted to emotions, anger, fear, chaos, those kind of things. Even if you don't want to be, it's hard if that's your normal, right? You kind of go back to those type of things. You can also become, kind of addicted to relationships, unhealthy relationships, particularly because they cause a lot of sort of very extreme circumstances, positive, negative kind of thing. There's not a lot of balance. People who typically, a lot of people I work with, they struggle with balance. And that's usually kind of when you struggle with addiction, it's hard to have that sort of middle ground. It's always one extreme or the other. It's either I'm completely closed off to it or I'm indulging in it to the point that it's affecting my life.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. And it's true also what you said about um it's normalized in the sense that sometimes we're not even aware that we are addicted because it's the normal thing to do, and everybody
Mhm.
has their own like faces and their own kind of addictions without even naming them as an addiction. I think the first step is to recognize, to acknowledge, and to become aware that this is an addictive pattern. I'm repeating the same triggers and the same rewarding results or whatever it is that we seek from any
Yeah.
addiction, the dopamine, the rush, the good stress, the hormones, anything else that may come with such experiences. So the main thing, I think the first step is to acknowledge that, and to maybe be able, I think being able to talk to someone like you about it is a very big step, because most people would live their whole lives either not even acknowledging that, like not
Yeah.
even being aware of what's happening, and eventually that would result in their like societal life or their social relationships being affected by such patterns, because I think
Right.
the patterns would repeat, like we will
Yeah.
seek the same things over and over again in different situations.
Yeah, patterns are very common for people if they struggle with addiction. In fact, a lot of the work we do at the very sort of more or less beginning of our recovery program or part of really kind of helps help people identify those patterns. I do think a big part of, when you're talking about sort of that idea people don't know they're addicted, I hear it very commonly. People don't know that this is an issue. People, especially with sex addiction, pornography particularly, it's the, kind of, well, this is what guys do, this is what's expected, this is kind of the norm. And so it escalates. And in some cases, it doesn't necessarily escalate to to the point that it's ruining somebody's life, but it certainly can affect your relationship, affect your worldview, affect how you see things, how you see relationships. That's a big part of it. And I'd also kind of go to the beyond with that, is that, then it ends up starting to affect what my thought life is. And if I spend an awful lot of time thinking about something, I'm probably going to end up doing those things. So fantasy can be incredibly dangerous in the sense that, if you spend a lot of time fantasizing about stuff that, that what maybe you think you're never going to do, that can be part of one of the escalations, is that I think a lot about whatever I'm fantasizing about. So that comes up quite a bit in a lot of the work that we do.
Yeah. Your education, Patrick, combines extensive theological training with clinical psychology. So, how do you integrate these two disciplines in your counseling practice, and how do they complement each other?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me, what I've kind of took away as far as kind of bringing the theological piece into it, I guess I'll speak more to a kind of general counseling before I talk about kind of specialty with addiction. But from a general perspective, and I think this is very much the way I kind of approach it, is that I try to let it be client based. If the person comes in and says, hey, I really want to work on some of these additional theological pieces, I want to do prayer in the sessions, or I want to add some element of it. Again, I'm coming from a Christian perspective, so there's a little bit of, a lot of those people are probably familiar with some of that background if that's what they're coming in for. So there's an element where I always kind of leave it to them. Okay, hey, what can what would you like to bring in? I'm willing to work with you on that aspect. It's kind of like an extension to what I do. Then from my addiction perspective, one of the things that comes up a lot in the SA, Sexaholics Anonymous type groups, and some 12-step programs, is that you have to have some type of theology to your life, or some type of higher power
Mm.
and something greater than yourself. And so that work is where that kind of comes into play, as far as, what do you believe in your life? And part of that's because you got to have a vision of where you're going, and like kind of having that connection of something you're giving back to. Now, a lot of times, especially if people feel like they're very empty, they don't have purpose, if they don't feel like they have reason for them to continue moving on, that addiction comes in and actually fills that void for them. And so one of the things I think that's become, important when it comes to looking at your addictive life is, what are you giving back to the world? Because if you're not giving back to something, you're going to find some way to fill that, so to speak. And again, relationships can sometimes do that, but I think a lot of times people end up filling it with stuff that's unhealthy. And so there's a lot of things that That's where some of the theology would come into play as far as maybe more from the addiction perspective.
That, that's very interesting because I've always believed myself that like the presence of like a religion or higher power or theology or any like higher idea of ourselves would help us feel anchored in the sense that it's easy to find purpose within that idea, and it's also easy to find this anchor, this feeling of being like grounded and having a baseline to your feelings, to your emotions, and eventually to your actions. Like what you're saying, like being addictive sometimes would inhibit the sense of purpose. I don't know if that makes sense, but it does to me. I don't know if that has like any psychological explanation.
Well, I think that one of the big things with the theology piece is that a lot of people, especially people that we work with, is that they've struggled in the sense that they sometimes have grown up from a very rigid belief system. So that if the belief system, especially if it's within the church, is that you can't engage in sex, sex is bad, those kind of things, wait till marriage and those and whatnot. And there's not a lot of education about that within the church. And I don't think that the Western church particularly has done a great job of being able to talk about sex in an appropriate, healthy way. And so what does end up happening is a lot of these people feel a lot of great shame about that anyway. And shame is usually a perpetuator for why these patterns continue. So if you feel shame about it, or you feel, Brene Brown has a great sort of definition of that as the fear of disconnect. So if you feel like that, if you bring it up, you're going to be church, you're going to be disconnected from your family, disconnected from your support system. What ends up happening is they kind of phrase those relationships. And so those people live in the shame sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that ends up affecting their relationship with God, because they end up looking at it as a situation, well, I'm just this broken person who can never get better. And they actually separate themselves from the rest of sort of, the world or society, or however you want to put that, as kind of this isolated person. And a lot of times that ends up actually creating more thoughts about acting out, because they figure what's the point of me getting any better, because I'm already this person that's isolated from everybody else. So there's a lot of things in there that kind of sort of, from a theological perspective, but really are skewed or twisted. They end up becoming actually hindrances for people actually getting better, because they see it as something that is they're already disconnected from anyway. And so how do I bring that in? So that does come up quite a bit. And I do think that you're right. If that's not my grounding, then how am I going to see my life moving forward?
Yeah, that makes much more sense. Yeah. Um, so are there any like common challenges that your clients face, any like particular patterns that they go through, and how do you help them navigate these issues?
Yeah, there's quite a few, I guess, maybe common things. One of the things that we talk a lot about is this idea that there's about sort of 10 criteria that sort of if you were talking about diagnostics, things that we would look for as far as that people commonly who struggle with sex addiction will have. Like I said earlier, one of them is this idea of having a rigid background, not being able to talk a lot about sex, the inability to stop the behavior, again, the inability to change your thought life. Some of those things are kind of pretty much the common ones we see. And one of the big patterns I think that comes with a lot, and we deal with this with our society more so now than we dealt with maybe 40 years ago. But I think the internet has changed a lot of how people approach sex, how people see sex, how people view sex, how people consume. And so those are a lot of those things that affect that. So, one of the things people will say, or a lot of people, when I first meet them, usually they try to just avoid. And avoidance is, I guess from a perspective of, is that your initial for maybe, your basic first steps? Yeah, absolutely. That's a great place to start, but you can't avoid everything. And there's a lot of stuff in our society that we're inundated with sex at all ages. So we need to be aware of the fact that it's not just avoidance, it's the ability to be able to sort of pivot from avoidance to replacement. And so I'm taking something and replacing what I used to do with something else that's healthier for me. So social media does not help that aspect, but let's just use Instagram as an example. So you have all these pictures that are non-sexual, but they actually are sexual. People hiking, people going to the beach, people doing whatever, right? There's all these things that are not meant to be sexual, but they are. And so then people sexualize those things, and okay, they're not necessarily looking at porn, but how do those images start that thought process to then end up going out and seeing a person in public, or going out and eventually, seeing, eventually turning to pornography during that period. It's common, the sort of technical term for that is called cruising. Sort of people start cruising until they get to that particular behavior. So one of the things we see a lot of is that people, again, they try to avoid, but then if they get frustrated because they can't avoid. And so what they do is another sort of addiction term is they kind of white knuckle, which means they tend to sort of just try to grab their fist and I'm just going to go right through it and I'm going to eventually stop. Eventually I'll lose the urge to do it. That usually doesn't work as far as, the ability to sort of stop. It usually just increases and then they struggle with that again with, sort of that cycle. It goes back to usually, a couple of times a week, could be a couple of times a month, usually more of like a binge purge kind of cycle. So you see that very commonly happen, especially people who are really actively trying to stop. People who don't see it as a concern or an issue, they probably aren't going to be purging because their binge is kind of continuous, so to speak. So those are some pretty common patterns, I'd say. Like I said, because of the internet, there's so many things that you can't avoid. So then you have to learn, how do I take my tools and be able to apply those so that I can replace those behaviors with healthier things so that I can, not do these types of behaviors anymore. That's the kind of from a simplistic perspective, that's sort of what we're all trying to work on.
Yeah, so talking about healthier alternatives, how do mental health and spirituality intersect? And how can integrating spiritual practices enhance psychological well-being?
Yes, I think the first part, from a mental health perspective, I mean, again, we talked about earlier, what am I thinking about? If my thoughts are very sexually oriented, I'm probably going to spend a lot of time trying to, again, plan when I'm going to act out, plan when I'm going to see this, plan when. So a lot of my time ends up becoming that I lose a lot of what myself is because the addiction sort of over a period of time starts to take over. I don't know, for those of you guys, anybody who's aware of Veggie Tales, there's this episode called the Fib from Outer Space, and basically it's this little ball that comes down to Earth, and every time the main character lies, this ball gets bigger and bigger until it's this monster and it has a hold of him. I think about that as being kind of an example of how the addiction grows, right? It's this very subtle thing, and over a period of time, eventually it's this little ball and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually it has control of my life. And the only way for it exposed is for people to put light on it. And again, how deep that looks depends on sort of the person's personal experience of that. But as when at the end of the episode, basically the more he tells the truth, the smaller the fib gets until it disappears. And that's very similar to how addiction is. And so a lot of times from a mental health perspective, you think about, it starts to consume your life on many levels. And again, it does this very subtly. It's not necessarily something that just tomorrow you wake up and I'm just thinking about sex all the time. It's sort of a progressive up until that point happens. So like we were talking about earlier, spirituality can help you ground some of those things and give you kind of that purpose piece, but it also gives you a regular, so like let's use like morning prayer, morning devotions, those kind of things. They give you a regular sort of framework that you're always working on, having that set thing that you're always doing that's productive and helping you to give back and feed into your spiritual life, as an example. But that also works with mental health stuff too. If you like going for a walk for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, just doing that physical exercise kind of stuff. And that's a basic, sort of mental health thing. Making sure you're connecting with people in a way that's deeper, more than level. These are all sort of kind of they intertwine, but I think really sort of theology and psychology both are on a sort of circle of what they all sort of look at. They look at life through a different lens, but they're all still trying to kind of answer the same question, which is really, kind of how do I, become the best person and best version of myself, so to speak, and how do I continue to grow as a person? Because that's a continuous process. None of us are necessarily going to arrive. We're never to a point where, we've been the best person. Now we're just going to be on the downside. No, we're always growing. We're always changing. We're always maturing. Now we're going to have times we're going to backslide because that's just being human. But I think are we continuously getting to a point where we're able to maintain and that we're able to live the healthiest life we can. And that's a proactive process, right? So we're continuing to do that. And so theology and mental health, I think, really try to answer a lot of that same kind of thing, whether it be that you're looking to, helping, having God help you and be able to grow your spiritual life with him and that relationship you have with him and working from that perspective, or whether or not you're having a relationship with yourself. And there's kind of a mutual, again, not that you want to be so self-focused, but you want to be making sure you have a healthy relationship with yourself, because a lot of times when it comes to addiction, one of the things a lot of people believe is that they're not worthy. And when they're not worthy, they don't do the things they need to do for themselves. And when we don't do things for ourselves, then it turns into one of these things where we have, again, this consumption of stuff that isn't healthy for us.
Wow. I think, yeah, I've been thinking about what you're saying now that you're talking. And I think when you said like people trying to stop addictions just by like stopping the behavior, trying to like stop it like at once, that does not work, because I believe addiction comes from a fantasy or a desire or an impulse that is not fulfilled, that is not expressed. It may have been expressed in that addiction just for the body or for the mind to be able to express that emotion, but it does not mean that this is the end result. This is just a symptom. So I think like when you start to want to stop an addiction, you need to first of all understand what's the impulse, what's the desire, what's the unfulfilled trigger or trauma or whatever it is that is within us that need to be processed before, and then eventually come up with solution to that root cause instead of just suppressing the symptom, because it will come again as another symptom, as it's the same as a disease, right?
Right. Yeah. So kind of touching on that, there's a scene from Harry Potter called the Mirror of Desire. And that particular scene is kind of an example of there's an exercise we do in the recovery program. It talks about that. And it's basically, if you were to look at your deepest desires, non-sexual and sexual, what would you see in your mirror, so to speak? And it starts to speak to what you're just saying, is that, what if our deepest desire is to have, let's say it's meaning or purpose or importance or significance. I'm just kind of naming some different things there. But if those are part of my mirror, so to speak, it's going to show up other ways, right? It's going to show up in my life, whether it be, how I deal with my money, how I deal with my family, how I deal with my time. But it's also probably going to show up in my fantasies regarding sexuality. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy or unhealthy from that perspective, but I would say that how it's being executed in my life can certainly affect myself and people around me. So I think it is important to do that kind of deeper work in that aspect and know kind of what is your desire, because if your desire is something that has been unfulfilled, how do you meet that need? Or maybe, doing the deeper work in that sense of being able to understand how to accept that need may not be met, because there's some things that, are going to happen that we can't change. And it's unfortunate, but that's part of being human. There's gonna be things that we're going to have to accept that are ugly, but that's just part of being human. And so I think there has to be some realism in it, as well as the fact that, there's also some places where we can get some different perspectives on it, which again, back to theology gives us some different understandings of kind of how the world's developed in that worldview. So I think there's a piece where a lot of that kind of comes together, but it's sort of independent to each person's experience from the perspective of, what do they desire? And is this something that they can understand, accept, and kind of heal from?
Now, can you see that the field of counseling and mental health is changing nowadays, particularly in the integration of psychological and spiritual care?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of things that are changing, I think, within the field in general, in a lot of ways. And so one of the things I would say, from an addiction perspective, is that there is a lot of people out there who are talking in a positive way more about it, which is a good thing, right? The more we can talk about, do conversations like this, have things where we can talk more about, what are the concerns, what are things to come up, what's the things to look for. I think the more awareness we have of it, which is a good thing. On one hand, I think there's a lot of people who are being more vulnerable, which if you look back at a lot of the research that's been done, not only just with sex addiction, but I would say addiction in general, and probably overall well-being, would be understanding vulnerability and being able to accept vulnerability and understand that vulnerability is not a thing that's to be feared. But I think with the vulnerability also comes how much do we respect each other, because there's a part of that if I'm going to be vulnerable, I have to also be willing to take the risk that you may reject me, but you also take the risk that you're going to be respectful of me on the other hand of it. So I think there is some changes in that aspect, that there seems to be some shifts. I think some of the recovery material and work and process that people have out there, again, there's all different kinds of schools of thought about how long that should take. I think it really depends on the person's experience about kind of how deep they have, kind of got into the addiction. And one of the things I think that's a little bit unique where we're at in our time right now is that there's a lot of people who've grown up with this addiction and have no idea that it's an addiction. Now, does that mean that it's turned into this life altering? It's blown their whole life up. They can't function? Not at all. But it is something that is I'll call it a functioning habit to some degree. And that sometimes needs to be snuffed out in our lives, because those things end up causing more problems for our interpersonal relationships, especially if you're in a marriage or a serious dating relationship. And I think then on the other hand of that as well, that's been changing with it, is that so there's been more resources out there for people to get help. Now, some of that help is very legitimate. Some of that help maybe is not so legitimate. But I think if you're finding help in different ways, that's a good thing. But don't undermine what other professionals are sort of working on too. I mean, I think there's lots of different perspectives of people being able to learn from each other, as well as, sort of personal experiences people have too. So there are changes. And then I think there's another side of it as well, how sex addiction is going to change too, because now we're getting into AI, we're getting into robots, we're getting into some of those kind of things. I mean, there's going to be an escalation from, this being more than just porn, more than just, those kind of things. It's going to move to a place where, people are going to have robotic significant others. People are going to have AI generated images. I mean, those are already kind of sort of getting there. So I think there's going to be a part of that that's also going to change a lot of that too. How is sex addiction going to look in 10 years? It will be different than it is even right now.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to think about, I think. And maybe like the counseling processes or the dealing with such new addictions would need maybe more creativity from counselors, or I don't know, like I don't know what to expect from such change.
Yeah, I think that the traditional, the big thing, and I say this because I'm in a process right now of just kind of understanding it, myself. But I think there's a transitional period where there's certainly a lot more people who are getting into life coaching and getting into sort of this kind of personal, sharing type things, and different sites, and obviously social media has really changed a lot of that. So it's not like a traditional type thing where you go see somebody, or the traditional kind of, at least in America, the traditional going to lay down on the couch kind of thing, which is a very
Yeah.
Freudian, outdated
Yeah.
anyway, but sort of that idea, that mindset. So I think we're kind of probably transitioning away from that. I mean, there's always going to be a need for recovery programs. There's always going to be a need for some of these types of things that are out there, but there are a lot of sources that are changing. And I think that is part of where mental health in a positive way can go, because there's certainly more people are getting more help more readily. But I think on the other hand of it is that, does that to some degree water it down a little bit? Does it make it somewhat a little bit scary for people in that sense, that they have people that they're really gaining good wisdom from? It can depend. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of people out there who don't have to have a degree, and they certainly are helpful for people. And then there's other people maybe who that may not be as influentially positive in some ways in that sense. So I think there's a lot there, but yeah, I do think there are things that are changing within the counseling realm for sure, the therapy realm.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I learned so much about this thing that you do that is really, really important, because dealing with addiction and helping people with addiction, that's very important. And I really, really appreciate your added value to society. And for sure, you've helped so many people deal with that and process these emotions, and get through these life challenges that sometimes get expressed in the wrong way, and we end up stuck in a vicious cycle. So thank you so much for being an awesome guest on the Success Catalyst podcast. And finally, what message would you like to leave with our listeners today?
Well, one of the things I always think about when I end these podcasts, and I've done this on a couple other ones I've talked about too, is that I always go back to there's a for the band, for those of you guys who know the band Switchfoot, they have a line in one of their songs that says "Every breath is a second chance," and I always feel like that really is an encouraging space to be in. Is the fact that we're never in the same spot for the even the next breath. We have opportunities to change, and we have opportunities to be able to grow. And so don't allow yourself to be the reason why you're going to stay in the same place. You have the ability to be able to overcome so much more than what you think you can. And so it is hard to take the next step, but the next step is certainly within reach. And so it's something to consider as you're moving forward, and hope that that's something that can be a blessing to people moving forward.
I love what you said, Patrick. Every breath is a second chance. I love that. It's so such a hopeful message, and such an encouraging thing to think about. I think it's a great thing to consider. Every breath is a second chance. Thank you so much for sharing this, Patrick. And thank you for being my guest today on the Success Catalyst again. This was Nina Robert, and this is the Success Catalyst. We'll see you back in the next episode.